Now, to some people, Idi Amin Dada is the Butcher of Uganda, a monster who filled rivers with bodies. To others, he was the man who stood up to Britain, mocked the empire and dared to take back Uganda from the outsiders.
Does this mean the end of the friendship with Britain you've had?
And that is now a lesson I'm teaching the British.
To many more, he was actually both. But here's the thing. The story you've heard and learned about Amin is not the full story. It has been told through headlines, rumors, and propaganda until it became easy to remember him only as a clown, a cannibal, and even a mad dictator. But that's the version the world was fed. The truth is far more complicated. Amin did not just appear from anywhere or nowhere. He was trained by the British colonial army, promoted for his brutality by the same British, and even celebrated when he overthrew Obote. Now, the very powers that later cast him never want you to know they actually helped him first. And those death tolls you hear about 300,000, 500,000, who counted them? Amnesty itself admitted these were just estimates based on testimonies of the disappeared, not body counts. The killings were real. Get me right. Those killings were real. The fear was real. But the numbers were turned into a weapon, repeated until they became a fact. Well, graves went unmapped, and families until date have been left with no answers. Now, they will go on and also tell us Amin expelled Asians out of pure hatred or racism. But what they don't tell you is that Britain had imported Indians to build the railway, then built an economy that shut Africans out of trade and credit. Asians became the buffer class. They were caught in between the colonizer and the colonized. Amin tapped into that resentment. Of course, he gave them 90 days to live and gave their businesses to his friends, but the result was definitely disastrous. The anger he exploited was born of colonial design. Now, they will also tell us that he was a buffoon, parading medals, giving himself absurd titles, writing love letters to the Queen. Now, was that just madness or was it theater? A way of mocking the very pomp of empire while keeping everyone inside and outside Uganda guessing what he would do next. His name also carried tension far beyond Uganda's borders. Britain, which had once groomed him, turned against him after the Asian expulsion. Israel, which had trained his army and built his airport, became his sworn enemy after he sided with the Palestinians and welcomed hijackers at Entebbe airport. Now, those betrayals turned him from an ally to an outcast in the Western press, and the image of Amin as a madman was born. So, today, we are going to peel back the mask. We will not excuse his terror, absolutely not. But neither will we recycle the myths that reduced him into a simple label. We will hold both truths at once. Amin, the brutal ruler who governed through fear, and Amin, the product of a system that trained him, used him, then abandoned him when he stopped serving their interests. Now, this is not the Western version. This is not his enemy's story. This is us trying to do what we are doing. We are trying to learn and relearn.
I am speaking as a great man who is the conqueror of the British Empire.
To understand the man Amin became, we have to step back to where it all began. Because Amin's story did not just start with coups, killings, or headlines. It began with the forces that shaped his character. Long before the world knew his name, Idi Amin Dada was not born in the halls of power. He was born around 1925 in Koboko, a dusty corner of northwestern Uganda near the Sudanese border. Now, his people, the Kakwa, were a small tribe, not the powerful Baganda of the south, not the Acholi or the Langi of the north, who later dominated the army. The Kakwa were outsiders in their own country. Now, his father, Andreas, converted to Islam. His mother, Ase Aate, was a healer. You know, the kind of woman people went to when sickness struck and hospitals were far away. She mixed herbs, prayed and treated the broken in body and spirit. Now, to outsiders, she might have looked like a witch doctor, but to the people in Koboko, she was life. She gave Amin his first lessons in strength and survival. Now, school, as we all know, it was not his cup of tea. He went for a few years, maybe up to 4th grade. That's it. He never learned the polished English of the educated elite. He never sat in university, lecture halls like Obote did. Instead, he grew up with the songs and stories of his people, the call to prayer from the mosque, and the wisdom of his mother's hands. Now, Western writers later mocked him for this. They called him illiterate, backward, and savage. But what they never admitted is that Amin's lack of Western education made him different. Not stupid. Different, not stupid. He did not obviously carry himself like the politicians in suits who spoke in English to impress the West. He spoke in Swahili, Luganda, and broken English. And the common people understood him. He laughed with them, boxed with them, swam in the Nile with them. He was very raw and polished, and in that way, he felt more like them than the elites ever did. Now, this mix, the son of a healer, raised in Islam, little schooling, gave Amin 2 things that would follow him forever. And this is number 1, a deep connection to ordinary Ugandans who saw him as one of their own. And number 2, a burning insecurity, because Amin obviously knew the intellectual class looked down on him. And when a man carries both charisma and insecurity, he becomes unpredictable. And that is the Amin that walked into the army. Now, the year is 1946. Uganda was still under the British rule, and the King's African Rifles, the colonial regiment, was recruiting young men who were tall, strong, and fearless. Amin fit the bill. He was very huge, athletic, already a boxer. He had little education, but now to the British, that was not a problem. In fact, it made him perfect. They did not need thinkers back then. They wanted doers, men who followed orders without asking too many questions. Now, the army became Amin's real school. Here, he learned that pain was a language and brutality was a tool. In training, he impressed his officers with his toughness, and masculinity. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau rebellion, he hunted down freedom fighters. Now, think about that. Africans are fighting for their land and their independence and their dignity, their freedom and everything else. And Amin, an African like them, was sent to crush them on behalf of the empire. That is where his reputation for ruthlessness was born. I mean, he was here in Kenya fighting the Mau Mau. Can you imagine that, But when you do good and the British look at you and they see you are strong, you are doing the work for us, we are definitely going to reward you. So they rewarded him for these things. Promotions came quickly. He fought in Somali. He fought in Kenya, back in Uganda. He became known as a soldier who never hesitated, never questioned. He never backed down. Now, to the empire, he was the perfect African soldier, strong, loyal to his superiors, and also feared by the people he policed. But what was happening to Amin inside was even more important. Each beating he carried out, each order he followed shaped him. He was learning that violence worked. He was learning that loyalty was not to his people, not to Africa, but to whoever held power above him. And he was also learning that fear could build a career faster than books or speeches ever could. Because if I do this and you guys, you are promoting me and you're making me feel important, then isn't this the way to go? And that is why, years later, when people call Amin a monster who came from nowhere, they miss the point. Amin did not just come from nowhere. He came from a system, a colonial machine that trained men like him to be instruments of violence. Amin wasn't the empire's accident, he was its product. And Britain need to own up, and also own up to the fact that they made an African monster. But now, every soldier, no matter how ruthless, needs a patron. For Amin, that patron came in form of a man who seemed like his complete opposite. And this man is Milton Obote. Obote was not a man of fists or aggressiveness. He was a man of words. Born in 1925, the same year as Amin, raised in Lango region, Obote had walked a very different path. He actually went to school, sat in classrooms Amin never saw, and even studied at the famous Makerere University before heading into politics. Where Amin struggled with English, Obote spoke it fluently. Where Amin's schooling ended in childhood, Obote surrounded himself with educated elites. But beneath the polish, Obote had his own insecurities. He knew he was not a warrior. He knew he was not a soldier. And in a young country like Uganda, power was very fragile. After independence in 1962, he became the prime minister. But he had to share the stage with Sir Edward Mutesa II. You remember us studying this guy in history, the Kabaka of Buganda, who still commanded deep loyalty in the south. Now, this arrangement looked very neat on paper, but in practice, this was war in waiting. In 1966, Obote decided, there can only be one center of power. This guy went and accused the Kabaka of plotting against him. He tore up the constitution and sent in the army. And at the tip of that spear was Idi Amin. Soldiers surrounded the palace at Mengo. There were tanks which shelled its walls, and the Kabaka's guards fought. But you know what? They were really overwhelmed. You are fighting against the Idi Amin? By nightfall, the king was fleeing in exile, in London. Centuries of Buganda monarchy were gone in just one single day. But again, this was not by Obote's speeches, his suit, his English. No, this was because of Amin's guns and Amin's leadership. Now, from then on, Obote started looking at this guy, and you know what? This guy is very important. So Amin became Obote's enforcer. He jailed opponents, he crushed dissent forces, and grew in stature. Yet beneath the surface, the relationship was uneasy. Obote saw Amin as useful, but very crude. A blunt weapon to wield, but never to fully trust. Amin, for his part, sat there and you knew what? Obote's circle is very educated. These are educated elites that are just here mocking me. The soldier and the intellectual needed each other, but neither respected each other because they know I hold this power, you hold that power. It's like they were calculating. Everyone knew where they had placed the other. Then, now came Obote's grand experiment, the famous move to the left in 1970. He announced sweeping changes. He nationalized Uganda banks, taking over foreign companies, pushing Uganda towards socialism. And you know what that simply means is nationalizing the banks is simple as the banks from today that were once owned by British and foreign investors were suddenly declared property of the Ugandan government. The profits would no longer flow back to London or overseas. Shareholders, at least on paper, you be a shareholder on paper, but you know what? The profits are going to stay here in Uganda. Taxing. He also took over foreign companies and also big businesses, from factories to import or export farms that had been in the hands of outsiders. And you know what? He said, I'm seizing this estate. Now, imagine waking up one morning in Uganda and finding out the shop you worked in or the factory in your town no longer belonged to an Indian merchant or a British boss, but the government in Kampala. Definitely to many Ugandans, this sounded like justice. Finally, what we've been fighting for is here. For years, they had definitely watched foreigners, Asians and Europeans, control the wealth. Well, as usual, Africans remained poor in their own land. Obote's words gave them hope. Uganda's riches would belong to Ugandans. But now to Britain, this was theft. To Western investors, this was a red flag. They saw years of business and profits slipping away overnight. They called it socialism, communism, dangerous. And now to Obote, it was a gamble. He was betting that Ugandans would definitely rally around him. that he could survive without Western money. But now, instead of making him stronger, it isolated him even more at home and abroad, because people started blaming him of corruption. People started blaming him of favorism and nepotism. When this guy was busy turning Uganda to the left, Amin is also there, making other kinds of friends, powerful friends, friends who brought money, weapons, and also training. And these friends were where? Or these friends were who? Israel. Now, in the 1960s, Israel was very desperate for allies in Africa. They were surrounded by Arab countries that hated them so much. Now, they looked south for partners, and Uganda was very perfect. Right in the middle of East Africa, close to the Nile, a country with an army they could shape. So the Israelis came. They built roads and projects, they expanded Entebbe airport, but most importantly, they trained Ugandans soldiers. And not just any soldiers, we are talking about Amin's people, his personal pride. They gave him weapons, drills, and even took him to trips abroad. Amin loved it. You know, Israel treated him like a real commander, not like the uneducated soldier Obote's people laughed at. Now, with their help, Amin secretly built an elite force that was fiercely loyal to him. The barracks whispered his name with respect, and abroad, Amin suddenly looked bigger. You know, he's standing next to Israeli generals and flying in Israeli planes. What can you tell Amin? Obote, meanwhile, was just here drifting further into socialism. He took over banks and foreign companies, as we said. He scared away investors, and Britain and the West began to turn their backs on him. At home, again, people continued accusing him of corruption and favorism, and abroad, he was losing friends. This created two Ugandas, one under Obote, the politician with big speeches but very few soldiers, and another quietly forming under Amin, the soldier with an army behind him and Israel by his side. The gap between Idi Amin and Obote began to grow wider every day. Now, Obote saw Amin's rise and grew suspicious. Amin saw Obote's policies and thought, you know what, these ones are dragging the country in trouble. By the late 1970s, it was clear something had to give. Obote had the pen, but Amin had the gun. Now, January 1971 came. Obote boarded the plane to Singapore, off to a Commonwealth meeting. You know, he thought he would return as president the way he left. But while he was away, still not actually away, even I don't think he ever made it to Singapore. When he was, no, he made it back. He was still in the air. Kampala was already shifting. Tanks rumbled onto the streets. Roadblocks went up. Radio Uganda cracked with new orders. Obote is finished. Idi Amin Dada is now in charge. You know, once that happens in Africa, the reaction is always different. But here, people actually supported the move. People came out, they cheered, because they were tired of Obote's heavy hand and dragging the country behind. Soldiers fired into the sky in celebrations. In the barracks, Amin's men hailed their commander. And far away in London, Washington, and Tel Aviv, Israel, there was pure silence. No mourning for Obote, no protest, no panic, no press statements. To them, Obote had been too socialist, too stubborn. And Amin, even if he had the flaws, was very easier to deal with. That day, guys, the boy from Koboko, trained by the British, backed by Israel, and carried by the army, became Uganda's ruler, not as everyone's enforcer, but as the man on the throne. Idi Amin, the man on the throne. But now, inside the barracks, the story was different. Amin knew his biggest threat was not on the streets. It was the army itself. The men who had marched for Obote were still there. These men were Acholi and Langi. Many of them were. And these men were Obote's tribesmen, his backbone in the military. Now, if they regrouped, they could topple Amin as quickly as he had toppled Obote. He could not risk that. So, the purge began. Quietly at first, soldiers were summoned for meetings and never came back. In some barracks, whole units were disarmed overnight. At Makandie and Nakasero, men were lined up questioned and dragged away. Families waited at the gates for their sons and fathers who never returned. Amnesty International, actually, in its 1978 country report, described this as a pattern of disappearances, arrests, torture, and murder by security forces. This is not rumor or hearsay. This is a system and these are facts. Now, victims later spoke of what happened inside. Now, survivors who slipped out of the State Research Bureau remembered being thrown into tiny cement cells, C1 or C2, where dozens were packed like animals. Now, at night, men were taken out one by one. Some were shot, others were beaten to death with hammers, and one torturer even bragged that his nickname was Nyagwawu, the hyena. Like, I'll torture you the way a hyena can torture someone. Henry Kiemba, once Amin's own health minister, before he fled into exile, later wrote that soldiers were killed in hundreds during these first months. His book, A State of Blood, gave chilling details. Bodies were dumped in the Nile, trucks carrying corpses out of the city, soldiers disappearing from the same barracks they had guarded a week earlier. Archbishop Janani Luwum, before his own death in 1977, told Bishop Festo that they are going to kill me. But he also said, I'm not afraid. Hours later, he was dead. Now, officially, the regime called it a car crash, but Kiemba admits he saw the bullet wounds. Now, how many died in these purges? That's where truth and propaganda blur. Amnesty spoke carefully and said tens of thousands, built from testimonies, not counted graves. The International Commission of Jurists suggested 80,000 to 300,000 during Amin's whole rule. Later, Western press inflated it further to 500,000. But here, in the early months, what we can say with certainty is this: thousands of Acholi and Langi soldiers vanished. Their families were left with no answers, their uniforms folded but absolutely empty. Why the numbers were inflated, we will definitely never know. Journalists who returned in 1979 after Amin fled were shown pits near Soroti, said to be dumping grounds for the bodies. They found earth that looked disturbed, but very few bones. Proof here was very slippery, contested up to date. That's the haunting part. Ugandans carry the grief, but the graves remain half hidden. The numbers are forever politicized. So when we say Amin secured his power, we must strip the line bare. He did not secure it through votes, of course. He did not secure it through policy. He secured it through fear, starting with men in uniform who once answered to Obote, soldiers who killed soldiers, barracks that became slaughterhouses, and from that blood, Amin built a new army, loyal not to Uganda, not to law, but to him alone. But now when we go back, are his ways of operation familiar? Can you sense the education that he was given all the way by the British? Can you see it reflecting even in what he's doing? The killings inside the barracks have left a lot of gaps. Now, Amin turned to the people he trusted most, his own, the Kakwa, the Lugbra, and the Madi. These are small tribes from West Nile, his home region. Now, these groups had never held power. In Uganda, now suddenly, under Amin, they were given ranks, guns, and new authority. To them, Amin was not just a president, he was their chance. Their future now depended on him. So, their loyalty was not to the country, but it stayed to Amin himself. Then, he looked beyond Uganda. He brought in Nubians from Sudan, tough fighters, the British had once used in their colonial armies. He hired mercenaries from Zaire and even from other neighboring countries. These men did not care about Uganda's politics. They did not know Obote. They did not care about Buganda or Lango or Acholi history. They cared about money, power, and also protecting the man who gave it to them, Idi Amin. Now, in a matter of months, the face of Uganda's army changed completely. The Acholi and Langi, once the backbone of Obote's forces, were gone. Now, in their place stood men who owed their whole careers, even their lives, to Amin. This was more than just moving soldiers around. The army was no longer Uganda's army. It was Amin's private army. Every promotion, every bullet, every paycheck was tied directly to him. That meant if he said fight, they fought. If he said kill, they killed. If he said disappear this man or make this man disappear, the man would definitely disappear. Now, people in the city began to notice the soldiers on the streets no longer look familiar. Their accents are very different. Their loyalty, obvious. And ordinary Ugandans started whispering, if Amin can turn on his own soldiers, what will stop him from turning on to us? Now, what began in the barracks did not just stay there. Once Amin had cleared out Obote's soldiers, the same fear spread to you ordinary Ugandans. Politicians who argued with him in parliament vanished. Students who protested were rounded up. Priests, again, who spoke too boldly, never came back. Families learned to cry in silence because even asking questions was very dangerous. But while fear ruled the streets, Amin showed another face to the world. You know, he became the joker president, the man who laughed, danced, and gave himself ridiculous titles. He called himself His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal, Alhaji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, conqueror of the British Empire. Foreign newspapers mocked him. Cartoonists drew him as a buffoon, and Amin enjoyed every headline because the laughter abroad covered the screams at home. And here is the part often forgotten. Amin was not stupid. I would like to think this man knew what he was doing. He was clever. He was theatrical, yes, but he also understood that power was not only about guns. It was also about performance. Every joke, every medal, every absurd title was a kind of theater. It distracted foreign governments and kept journalists busy, and also made the world underestimate him. I think I see that pattern in someone lately. Very theatrical. He says things and then we go and we talk about it, and then we forget the most important things. I think that's something African leaders have learned, to make sure that they are distracting the masses, you know. They play the clown and then they are hiding the tyrant in within. You know, we gotta give it to Amin. Huh? That was his genius also. Cruel, but also a genius in some way. He played the part perfectly. He swam in the Nile for cameras, shadowboxed for reporters, wrote love letters to the Queen, and called himself the last king of Scotland. Outsiders saw comedy, Hollywood saw movies, Ugandans saw a mask. Behind the medals and jokes were torture cells at Makindi and Nakasero. There were cars with dark windows, patrolling at night, and neighbors who disappeared without a trace. And the mask worked. Western governments that should have condemned him played along when it suited them. Britain, Israel, even America all dealt with Amin in those early years. To them, he was clown enough to laugh at, but strong enough to do business with. Only later, when he turned on them, did they start calling him a monster. And this part is very important because we've seen a lot of, because Western worlds stand as, you know, they speak with so much moral authority. We condemn what is happening in Uganda. But look at all these things that were happening. They never condemned. And the only time they will start condemning Amin is when Amin decides, you know what, I'm going to join forces with Gaddafi, the Palestinians. I'm not going to play with the British or the Israelites anymore. So when he's good enough for us, no matter what he's doing in his country, we remain quiet. But when he turns against us, let's start calling this man a madman. Let's actually start calling him a monster. But you know, that was Amin's trick. He will be laughed at, he will give you the jokes and the stories, and he will continue ruling through fear at home. And together, the fear and the mask kept him in power. Now, the laughter abroad kept the cameras busy, obviously, but inside Uganda, Amin was planning something big, something that would make the world stop laughing and start watching. One August afternoon in 1972, Amin went on radio and gave an order that stunned the country.
You just wait after 3 months.
What will you do to them?
Okay, you will see.
You said you wanted...
Asians had 90 days to leave Uganda. By the way, he just went and said that Asians, you have 90 days to leave Uganda. To understand why this hit the world so hard, we have to go back to the way the British built Uganda's economy. It was never designed for Africans to win. The British put themselves at the top, owning the biggest companies, the banks, and the land. Now, beneath them, they placed the Indians' families, brought in first as railway workers, then later encouraged to stay and run the shops, the transport systems, the factories. And then at the very bottom, you have Africans doing hard labor, growing coffee and cotton, but locked out of credit, locked out of trade, and locked out of opportunities. Now, it was like a ladder with 3 rungs, you know. You have Europeans at the top, Indians in the middle, Africans at the bottom of the barrel. And obviously, the bottom rung was nailed down. Africans could not climb, banks would not lend them money, shops would not give them credit, licenses for trade were denied, and they were told, work the land, pay your taxes, but don't expect to own the economy. Now, this will definitely leave a lot of scars. Ugandans would walk through towns where every shop sign carried an Indian name, where bus companies, textile mills, even the corner kiosks were run by Indians. Now, if an African farmer wanted a loan to expand his crop or his yield, he had to go to an Indian shopkeeper or a bank that favored Indians. If he wanted to start a business, he was told no. Well, the others got yes. For decades, Ugandans felt like second-class citizens in their own home. So, when Amin announced the expulsion, many Ugandans cheered. They thought at last the chains were breaking. Our turn has come to eat. It's our turn to eat, they said.
It's good. It's good for them to go. Why? They have sacked us enough.
And this definitely sounded like justice. But what followed was chaos. Amin's orders did not just target those with British passports. Soon, even Indian families who are Ugandan citizens felt unsafe. Soldiers set up roadblocks, families were stopped, harassed, sometimes even robbed at the airport. People were told they could only take just 2 suitcases. Everything else, houses, shops, savings, everything else stayed behind. And Britain, the country that had once planted this community in Uganda, now scrambled to pick up the pieces. Over 27,000 Asians with British passports were flown to the UK. Britain was not prepared. Towns like Leicester suddenly received waves of refugees. The government had to spend millions and millions resettling them and finding them housing, jobs, schools, etc., etc. At first, even local councils tried to block them, but slowly that expelled community rebuilt. But you can imagine the shame. You can imagine the shame Britain endured in front of the whole world. You get it? But now inside Uganda, the cost was even greater. Businesses that were seized from the Asians were given to Amin's loyal people. You have the army officers, the relatives, etc., etc. He called it economic war, but these men did not know how to run banks or factories. They knew how to march, not manage. Shelves in shops emptied, spare parts disappeared, soap and sugar became scarce, machines broke and stayed broken. Now within months, the economy was coughing. And then within years, Uganda's economy was collapsing. And the human side, of course, some Ugandans workers were glad to finally own the shops they once served in. But many cried as their Asian neighbors left. You know, obviously, friendships, partnerships, and even mixed families were torn apart overnight. Now, the world saw Amin's move as madness, but in Uganda, it was very complicated. He had tapped into a real wound, the bitterness of being second class in your own land. Yet now, instead of healing that wound, he tore it wider. So when history asks, was the expulsion justice? Was it cruelty? Was it both? The answer lies in this paradox. Amin was right about the problem, but the way he acted left Uganda poor, weak, and more divided than ever. The expulsion of Asians did not just empty shops in Kampala. It snapped Uganda's ties with the outside world. Britain moved fast. This was the old colonial master, and Amin had just humiliated them on the global stage. He had not just kicked out their former subjects, he had mocked Britain as weak, called himself the conqueror of the British Empire, and paraded as the man who had beaten the old ruler at its own game. Now, for London, the insult cut deep. Overnight relations collapsed. Aid and trade was cut off. Diplomats were pulled back. Britain would never again treat Amin as a trusted partner. Now, I need us to circle back on something. When Ugandans themselves are being killed by Amin, no one is speaking. But touch one of our own and we are going to show you dust. Then you have Israel coming in next. Now, for years, as we said, Israel had been Uganda's closest military ally. They trained Amin's army. They built Entebbe airport. They supplied weapons and gave Amin prestige as a modern commander. But after 1972, Amin also turned against them.
Uganda was going to be bankrupt. That is the reason why I chased away the Israelis.
He accused Israel of cheating Uganda and exploiting its resources, and also siding with its enemies. Now, one by one, Israel advisors were also sent packing. And then Amin switched sides. He leaned hard into the Arab world, loudly declaring his support for the Palestinians. It was a dramatic flip. Just a few years earlier, he had toasted with Israel's generals. Now he was marching with their enemies. Now that's when Muammar Gaddafi stepped into the scene. You know, he came with oil money, eager to challenge the West. He saw in Amin a brother in arms. He sent money, he sent weapons, he even sent Libyan soldiers when Amin's grip looked shaky. Amin, always the showman, wrapped himself in Arab robes, waved Quran in public, and told Ugandans that Allah had given him new allies to replace the British and Israelis. But the truth beneath the theater was this: Amin had not gained power, he had lost it. By breaking with Britain and Israel, he had shut the door of trade, aid, and diplomacy. That is what kept his regime alive. And now the handouts from Israel were gone, and there was fear at home. By 1976, Amin's shine was fading. The British had walked away from him. Israel, once his best friend, was now his enemy. Shops were empty, the economy was choking, and people in Uganda lived more in fear than in hope. But Amin still had one trick that worked: theater. He knew how to keep the world watching, so he continued doing all his theatrical things. Then something happened that put Uganda on the very front page. Now, an Air France plane flying from Israel to France was hijacked by Palestinian fighters. They forced it to land in Entebbe airport, the very same airport Israel had once helped Amin build. Now, the hijackers were armed, the passengers were very terrified, and Amin, instead of fighting them off, he welcomed them. He strolled across the tarmac, smiling, waving, telling the world that he was a mediator. But inside the airport terminal, it was no joke. Over 100 hostages sat on the floor, scared and hungry. Then came the most cruel moment. The hijackers, with Ugandan soldiers standing by, began separating people, Jews and Israelis on one side, everyone else on the other. Now, families were split, names were being called out, passports were being checked. For survivors, it felt like stepping back into Europe's darkest nightmare, the Holocaust. And Amin, he's there playing host. He gave radio talks, smiled for cameras, shook hands with the hijackers as if this was a show. This was definitely a show for him. And you have to ask, if he was truly a mediator, because again today we are saying we are going to ask the most important questions. If he was truly a mediator, like his supporters always want to believe, why were his soldiers guarding the hijackers and not the hostages? Why did he smile while people were divided like cattle? Now, for a week, the world waited. Diplomats were there arguing. Families begged. But Amin is there, soaked up in all this. He loved the attention. And you know what? He thought he had the stage under control. Then July 4th came. In the middle of the night, Israel commandos flew in, low and very quiet. They even used a black Mercedes like Amin's to trick the guards at the gate, turning his love for flashy cars into a weapon against him. In a flash, gunfire filled the airport. Soldiers stormed the terminals and killed the hijackers and freed almost all the hostages. Within 1 hour, they were gone, flying home. Uganda was left humiliated. Now, for the first time, Amin looked weak. The man who had called himself the conqueror of the British Empire had been outsmarted in his own house. The showman's mask had cracked, and his range was very swift. Dozens of Ugandans accused of helping Israel were executed. One woman, Dora Bloch, an elderly hostage who had been in hospital during the raid, was dragged out of her bed by Amin's men and murdered. That was the final straw for Britain. They cut all ties with him. But Britain, did you not teach him these tactics? Did you not send him to fight your wars and kill other Africans? Now, Entebbe left very heavy questions. Did Israel save lives? Of course they did. But did they also break Uganda's sovereignty? Of course they did. Why do people celebrate the hostages saved, but barely remember the Ugandan soldiers who died that night? Some people will ask such questions. And was Amin really trying to mediate, or was he just playing along, using the hijackers as props in his never-ending performance? You tell me. What we know is this. Entebbe exposed Amin. The laughter stopped. The world stopped seeing a clown and started seeing him for the true person he was. And at home, after being humiliated, Amin only tightened his grip, ruling with even more fear than before. By the late 1970s, Amin's power was fading. The world was not scared of him anymore. It laughed at him. At home, people saw through the jokes. On radio and the endless titles he gave himself, people saw through that. Because food was running out, shops again were bare, soldiers were not being paid. And when soldiers go unpaid, everyone suffers. The same soldiers started setting up roadblocks, stopping buses and trucks, demanding money and stealing from people. To ordinary Ugandans, a simple journey to the market or to see a family member became a gamble. Will I get home safe? Will I be robbed by the soldiers? Will they stop me with their guns? Meanwhile, in Tanzania, guess who is looking at this and watching quietly? President Julius Nyerere. Nyerere had never liked Amin, not from day one. He was also close friends with Milton Obote, the man Amin had pushed out in 1971. When Obote fled, Nyerere gave him shelter, and not just a roof. He also gave him space to rebuild. In Tanzania, Obote's men trained in camps. Uganda would call them rebels. Tanzania called them refugees. But everybody knew there was something boiling. This one was war in waiting. Because for years, it was a cold war across the border. Uganda troops accused Tanzanians of harboring enemies. Tanzania accused Ugandans of raiding villages. And then there were definitely the radio interviews where insults were passed. There were a bit of small clashes here and there. It was like dry grass waiting for a spark. And that spark came in late 1978. Amin's men crossed into Kagera, a strip of Tanzanian land. Now, some say they were chasing rebels. Others say Amin, cornered at home by a failing economy and grumbling soldiers, needed a quick win to look strong. Now, whatever the reason, he went on radio and declared that Kagera was now Ugandans. He said Kagera was Ugandans. Now, signs went up. There were songs that were sung. For Amin, this is another show, another win for me. But this time, Nyerere is not clapping. He sent in the Tanzanian army they pushed Amin's soldiers out of Kagera, and then he made a very bigger choice. Don't stop at the border. Keep going. Go straight into Uganda. And with them came the Ugandan exiles who had been training in Tanzania for years. Men who had lost families to Amin's purges, men who wanted revenge, men who now called themselves the Uganda National Liberation Army. Amin's army looked big on paper, you know. There were tanks, planes, long lines of men in uniform, but inside it was very hollow. Years of purges had chased out the best officers. You know, those who were left were men who feared Amin more than they understood war. They could beat an armed civilian, steal from them, but they could not hold the line against a trained army. Now, town after town, Masaka, Mbarara, Matukula fell. Some soldiers fought a little, most ran. Many stripped of their uniforms and melted into the crowd. Amin called for help. Obviously, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya answered. Planes landed with Libyan troops, weapons even from Palestinian fighters. Amin paraded them like trophies, proof he still had powerful friends. Now, for a moment, it looked like he might survive. Then came Lukaya, a small town, but a turning point. On the first day, Libyan guns and Amin's men pushed the Tanzanians back. Now, for one night, Amin's side cheered, but the next morning, the Tanzanians came again, slower, very steady, bridge by bridge, trench by trench, until Lukaya fell. After that, nothing stood between them and Kampala. In the capital, fear spread like smoke. Radios carried half-truths. Soldiers looted shops and disappeared. Others ran north to their home districts in West Nile. Families stayed indoors, whispering prayers. And then, in April 1979, Tanzanian tanks and UNLA fighters rolled into Kampala. Crowds poured out. Some danced, others wept. Relief and dread, mixed in the air, because Ugandans knew when one ruler falls, another is always waiting. And Amin, the conqueror of the British Empire, was running for his life. He promised to regroup in Jinja, then Arua, but his words meant nothing. He boarded a plane to Libya, hugged by Gaddafi for cameras, and from there he slipped into Saudi Arabia. But why Saudi? Because Amin had spent years wooing the Arab world, waving the Quran, back in Palestine, declaring Uganda part of the Arab struggle. Now, Saudi offered him a deal. You can live here, but you must stay silent. No politics, no speeches, no plotting. Just stay silent. And so the loudest man in Africa was silenced. The Saudis gave him a villa in Jeddah's rich Al-Hamra district. He was also given a monthly stipend that covered his bills. He was offered private schools for his many children and even flights of Ugandan food so he could eat the dishes he missed. Some neighbors in Saudi spotted him at markets. Obviously, a giant man, flowing in robes, carrying shopping bags. And when his health failed, he was treated at King Faisal Specialist Hospital, one of the best in the country. Now, while families in Uganda were still searching for their missing people, Amin lived quietly. Cushioned by Saudi oil money, he wasn't dragged to court. He wasn't forced to confess. He lived like an awkward guest the world preferred to forget. And in 2 or 3 years, you all know, his body finally failed. He was buried in Jeddah, Saudi. No trial, no confession, no final reckoning, just silence. Now, to many Ugandans, Amin's end was not simple. The war that removed him brought its own scars. Soldiers looted, revenge killings targeted West Niles and Nubians. Amin's people, guilty or not, were murdered. The rebel groups that had united against him soon broke apart. And then you go on in the history, 1980, elections brought Obote back, but instead of peace, Uganda plunged into the bush war of the Luwero Triangle, where thousands more died. So what really ended Amin's rule? Because it was not one thing. Entebbe had humiliated him. The expulsion of the Asians had wrecked the economy. Years of purges had, weakened his army. Britain and Israel had cut him off. Gaddafi could send troops, yes, but not legitimacy. Nyerere, loyal to Obote and tired of Amin's games, finally moved, and obviously ordinary Ugandans, sick of fear and hunger, no longer believed in him. Now, the West likes to tell it neatly. They like to tell, the story of how the bad man fell, the good guys won. But Ugandans know the truth was messier. There are Tanzanian families who also buried their sons. You have Ugandan civilians who were crushed between armies. You have Libyan soldiers who died in a fight that was not even theirs. And when the dust settled, Uganda's pain did not disappear. It only changed shape. And that's how Amin's story ends. Not in handcuffs, not in a courtroom, but in exile, in silence, in a villa, with stipend, enjoying life while living behind a country still divided over his rule, over what his rule really meant. Now, in the end, Amin's legacy forces us to hold two truths at once. He was a tyrant who ruled with fear, who destroyed lives and left Uganda bleeding. But he was also not born in a vacuum. He was trained, armed, applauded before he was condemned. The same world that called him a monster had once given him the tools to rule. The British had turned him from a barefoot boy into a soldier of empire. They shaped him in the King's African Rifles. They taught him to fight colonial wars, to obey without question, and to equate violence with authority. And now, Israel later on polished his career, building his army, training his people, and even expanding the airport. For a time, Amin was not the enemy in their eyes. He was not a monster. He was a partner, a useful man. Only when his violence slipped out of their control did he suddenly become the mad butcher. And then there were the rumors, the stories of cannibalism. Western papers ran them eagerly, painting Amin not just as cruel but also inhuman. Did he eat human flesh? Really? Do you believe that? Because no court ever proved it. I actually saw a conversation with his son, I think it's on NTV, saying the person that is said to have been eaten by Amin is in France enjoying life. So you wonder, why were we fed these cannibalism tales? Why? Why were we fed these tales? Because hard evidence was never shown. What mattered to the world was not the truth, but the image. A black African dictator who was not only a killer, but a cannibal. It fit every racist stereotype. It turned Amin into a horror story that no one stopped to ask the hard questions. Who built the stage Idi Amin performed on? Who did that? Who did? But then, when Amin died in Saudi, we see a bit of split here. You have some headlines that cheered that the butcher was gone. Others asked, why has he never stood trial? Because in Uganda, the mood was very mixed. The victim families felt cheated. Their tormentor had slipped away without even confessing, without ever facing justice. And yet, other people were just like, he's gone. Because to them, Amin was just one chapter in a long chain of leaders who brought suffering. And this is where Amin's story stings most. Because if we only call him a monster, we miss the bigger picture. Monsters don't rise alone. They are nurtured, trained, and sometimes even celebrated until they outlive their usefulness. Then they are cast aside, leaving ordinary people to live with the ruins. Uganda still carries those ruins. Families still ask where their loved ones are buried. Historians still argue over numbers and propaganda, and the world, which once trained and armed Amin, prefers to remember him as a clown or a cannibal, anything but a mirror of its own fingerprints. So the real question is not just who was Idi Amin. The question is who made Idi Amin. And if the world could create him once, How many more can it create again? Yeah, he was a tyrant, but he was also a creation. And until the world admits the part it played in making monsters, we will keep burying them in silence while their victims still cry out for justice. You know, at the beginning, it's worth remembering that Amin wasn't always the villain. In the early days, London, Israel, and even Washington celebrated him. Why? Because Milton was leading to the left. I honestly don't know. I feel like personally I know what to make of this conversation. There is one truth that we must all agree on, that Idi Amin was definitely not a good man. But that evilness, that monster came from somewhere. And the more you take a look at Idi Amin's story, the more you realize this is a pattern the West likes to use, where they create a monster, and this monster is used to ruin the natives or the people in these specific countries. And then when they are done with this monster, to them, it's just headlines, you know. But to the people who are left behind, there is so much damage. Because if Britain and Israel were really invested in how bad Idi Amin became, can we see them being invested in making sure that the victims, you know, get justice? When people ask, why is it that Idi Amin was not touched? Or why is it that there were no cases even opened for him at ICC? Yeah, he was hosted by Saudi. I don't think Saudi is a member. But at the end of the day, some people say it's because Amin held secrets for Britain, for Israel, and for other Western countries. And they knew these secrets are better left where they are. We don't need this man speaking about the things we trained him to do. And that is why sometimes people ask, all those years, Amin became untouchable. What if he was being protected by the same people who trained him to kill his own people? And that's a trend we see in African countries. And I'm so sorry today, I do not have a lot of answers for the people who would want to believe Idi Amin was a good man. Again, it's a very mixed conversation, because he still has his loyal people who say he was a better leader than Milton Obote. We will do an entire series on Milton Obote soon, but I really want you to share with me what your thoughts are. Calling him the Butcher of Uganda is easy, but who made that butcher? Who made him a butcher? Who trained him to be a butcher? Right? Who trained him to be this monster? And look around your presidents. Do you see the same behavior? Do you see them being trained to be monster to their own people? And then, you know, when all this is over, they'll just exile into a safer place. You know, I honestly was looking forward to finding some good things about this man. Not much. He is what he is. He was evil. That we can all agree on. But again, I think for us, the most important question would be, who made this person a monster? And that answer is very clear. That answer is very clear. If you look deep, you will see how some of these African subjects are made monsters to serve the Western powers. And ask yourself, is my president the next Idi Amin? You know, because some of them are doing things that are even worse than what Idi Amin used to do. Things we can point, we are not going and saying, okay, I think there was a grave here or there. We are seeing graves, we are seeing people dying, we are seeing people being shot, and, you know, we can see these things happening. So I honestly don't know, but I appreciate you guys for tuning in and learning more about Idi Amin with me. Looking forward to documenting Obote, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, and also now how Obote failed the state that trusted him again, and how Museveni came to power. So, our people in Uganda, I hope this has helped answer a few questions here and there. Even if you're watching this outside Uganda, let me know what your thoughts are. What have you picked, and what can we definitely improve on? Remember, we are trying to learn and relearn. So let's also be very respectful at the comment section. You guys have done an incredible job being active participants and just sharing your thoughts on the comment section. That is really appreciated. And if you've watched this until the end and you have forgotten to subscribe, please remember to subscribe and like this video. It goes a long way. And also, if you want to support our work, we do have a PayPal account. The details are on your screen. Feel free. We also have an M-Pesa number and a paybill number. Please feel free, or join our super thanks right there. You can see it right there. Yeah, that super thanks. It also works. But if you cannot do any of that, remember, by sharing this video, it really helps to make sure that this is being seen by a wide range of audience, right? So shukran sana. See you guys on the next one. Let me know who you would want us to look at next, and I will definitely keep that in mind. Bye bye.